Now we have about 20 minutes to have a conversation about rebuilding global security architecture, beginning from the bottom upwards and outwards, taking advantage of different kinds of opportunities to rethink ways in which we can live more peaceful lives. We've got Lisa's concern around how do we create a digital public square to defend democracy, and Janani's just giving us this insight into ways in which we can begin making a difference around climate change, which is always important. So over to you for questions and comments. Ria.
Hello, thank you so much for the insightful presentations. I have a question for Janani. It's with regards to discourse on climate-induced non-economic losses and damages. You mentioned earlier in your presentation that one of the important conflict drivers that we have to be aware of is loss of social cohesion. So when there are climate-induced consequences that will force relocation, displacement, migration of a particular group of people, then naturally it is easy for them to lose their community, see their social cohesion destroyed, and as a result, that also leads to loss of cultural identity, indigenous traditional knowledge, no continuity in their in loss of ontological security. So there are many intangible losses and damages that are associated with people getting displaced or forced to relocate because of climate change. However, the discourse, on non-economic loss and damage and how they could be compensated is still very weak, I think, amongst the global policymakers. And I'm guessing it's because it's so difficult to quantify, right? Yeah, but we've been talking about this in Toda Peace Institute for years, but has there been any, since, Janani is, well connected to the policy world, has there been any progress in terms of supporting individuals, with regards to the loss of intangible assets?
That's a great question, Ria. I think you probably know the answer, but unfortunately, it's a very, very tiny part of the global discourse. I think it's incredibly important, and it comes up when the conversation and therefore the policy responses are locally informed, when they listen to those communities that are affected, and that this informs the policy position. But this isn't really the case. So often these policies are designed by technical folk, and this is one of the challenges of climate action, is that it is seen as very technical. Mitigating greenhouse gas emissions is done by climate change experts and climate modelers, and adaptation, how to help communities adapt to climate change, are done by kind of hydrometeorological or kind of soil experts, and these very technical climate experts who are not looking at things from a socio-cultural perspective often at all, and certainly not even from a conflict sensitivity perspective. I think another challenge is that a lot of this global policy has been largely informed by climate security research, even if it's localized, from a very different geographic context, from the African subcontinent. And there, the conversation isn't so much about relocation, and it's certainly not about the same kind of non-economic losses that are being faced by communities in the Asia Pacific, and particularly in the Pacific Islands. So there's a real gap in the knowledge base that is informing the policy positions. So I think the work that Toda's doing is really, really important. And it's important to make sure this is magnified and really feeding into these policy spaces, because really it's a tiny voice, and I've seen so little research on this. Yes, it's hard to quantify, but that doesn't mean it shouldn't be discussed, and it isn't impossible. Right?
Other questions and comments? Yep. Joan.
It's not really a question, but I just wanted to thank all of you for giving hope. I feel much more hopeful. Of course, all the presentations have been excellent, but I think each of you has given the idea that, yes, at the local level, there are always possibilities. And I wonder if you could maybe each elaborate a little bit on ways of starting. I know, Lisa, your topic was maybe less accessible to all of us, but I think just this idea that these massive monopolies might crumble is very hopeful. So yeah, if each of you could maybe expand a little on sort of how at the local level people can see ways forward, that would be great. Thank you.
Well, should we do that in order? Lisa, you start first, and Keith, and finally Chinani.
So I've been working with these small platforms called deliberative technology, Polis and Remesh. I mentioned it last year, and our Toda workshop this year brought together a group of about 50 peace builders to learn how to use these small platforms to foster dialogue. They've been using it in Israel-Palestine. I think I mentioned that last year when I was here. Well, now they've had a full year of using Remesh among Israelis, among Palestinians, coming up with some common sets of principles for what a way forward is. We're working also in Afghanistan with these very small platforms that are really just showing us it is possible. People who are at war with each other and really disagree with each other can talk to each other on these platforms if they are designed in a way to help people listen to each other. So I have a lot of hope. We definitely need several more years of developing these platforms, but there's just a lot of energy, especially in Europe, but also in other regions of the world. In Kenya, in Bangladesh, small tech companies are designing new platforms that are more culturally attuned and more pro-social, and that I think could point the way to a future. And if they're interoperable, you don't have to be a monopoly. You don't have to be huge. You can create a platform that will talk to people in other parts of the world that are on different platforms. So this is what we have to imagine 5 to 10 years from now, that we'll have a very different internet made up of a lot of small platforms that are more culturally sensitive, work in different languages, and are not run by American billionaires.
Thank you. Keith?
I want to elaborate a little bit on something I skipped over very, very quickly in the interest of time. And one of the points is that many of the conflicts that Kevin and I mentioned, 55 conflicts around, are actually relatively small and driven by local grievances, some of which are the things that Janini and others spoke about, Janani. And it would be important, I think, to encourage, therefore, what we know from the literature, which is local efforts among sometimes traditional leaders, sometimes faith-based groups, sometimes civil society organizations, to avoid the escalation of some of these conflicts, because they are mobilized, or the grievances are mobilized by political elites in a top-down fashion. So how do you create a kind of a fire break, if you will, or some kind of bulwark against top-down mobilization for their own interests of grievances that could be resolved at a local and community level? And we have evidence from places such as Indonesia or northern Nigeria where the conflict did not spread, or where it did not break out, in part because of these kind of local efforts. So it's not just a plea to say, well, let's all be nice and local, but there is some evidence that can prevent escalation and what we would call instrumental top-down mobilization, because that's also what we see in the United States, right? The mobilization of discontent by leaders for their own interests. So building from the bottom up is a way to somehow insulate a little bit against that. And I think that would be, often goes under the label of resilience, which is something we could spend a long time talking about, but I think is an important dimension. And it echoes very well some of the things you spoke about the adaptive strategies for coping with conflict. So I'm going to throw it to you.
Yeah, Chinani, signs of hopefulness in climate change.
I think there. I was trying to think of a local level. We have not with Toda, but with my other hat, I manage a program called Weathering Risk. It's a flagship project on climate, peace, and security. And as part of that, there's something called the Peace Pillar, which looks at peace building activities happening in real time in about 5 different contexts, and how they can be more impactful through the integration of climate security risks in them. They operate at very different levels. One example that is very tangible is the work in Iraq. Iraq is incredibly climate affected, and it's also really struggling to kind of rebuild social and societal structures and institutions that people trust. And the work that's being done there is really small. It's not groundbreaking. It's provincial level dialogues with formal local leaders and with communities, and it's essentially about the climate and environmental shocks that they're facing. And these dialogues are really just a space for discussion and and for information exchange, but we're finding that they're really promoting state-civilian relations. It's also bringing together kind of civil-military relations, because there's still a lot of kind of need for the police force and the armed forces to be trusted and accepted by a society that really doesn't have much hope in it. So the role of the military and the police in addressing some of these climate and environmental risks is actually giving them a kind of a civilian role, which helps build that trust. So there are these entry points. The larger scale opportunity I also want to flag is around climate financing, and I touched on this, and I think that there's a real acceptance by a number of the big climate donors that you cannot really get anywhere kind of pouring money into kind of climate adaptation in countries that are already fragile unless you take account of the fragility. So there's a lot of movement on ensuring that enough of this climate finance does actually go to fragile states, because they are the most affected. And so there is a space at the moment which I think we need to really maximize and take advantage of to ensure that climate finance is conflict sensitive, because there's a real opportunity to ensure that this is then going to ensure that every single dollar of climate finance is then at least going to do no harm to conflict dynamics, but where possible can actually promote peace.
Thank you. Yes, Tucker again, and then our colleague behind you.
That's a big question. So advertising is how they're making it. It's the most profitable industry in the world is social media companies. So Musk and Zuckerberg are the wealthiest men in the world because they have figured out how to extract data from all of the world's children who are on social media all the time. And then they sell this information to advertisers who target not only with products, but also with political messages. So this is the manipulation, the political manipulation of the youth also, which is very dangerous, obviously. So, yeah, we need to change the profit model to say that you should not be able to extract data from people, and so privacy matters, and this is why the Europeans have passed these privacy regulations. Over the last week, we know that Musk basically went into several departments of the U.S. government and extracted huge amounts of data. So this was not about cutting the budget for the United States. What Musk has just done is created a huge data bank of private information of taxpayers in the United States. So how do we get the public to understand that data, it equals money, and that he has basically just robbed billions more? The wealthiest man in the world now has the access to manipulate even more people because of the private data that he's gathered. I don't have a full answer to that, but I do want to just say, because of the subtitle up here above me, it's all evolving very quickly, this profit model and how to monetize people's private data, surveillance capitalism. This is basically what is at the core of what Musk's strategy is in Washington.
Thank you. Keith, do you want to make any comments on that?
Not on the digital part, but on the first part of your question. I also didn't go through the long list of things that the neoliberal agenda has promoted, but obviously one of them was destruction of unions and the labor movement, deregulation, privatization, deregulation in all sectors, precarious work, weakening the social safety net, and reduced role of the state in any of these regulatory dimensions. And this is a 40-year project, so we're at the cutting edge of that, but there's nothing new. Elon Musk and others are just taking advantage of a set of forces that were put in place several decades ago. And that means it's going to take several decades to reverse it, which is the bad news. But it is reversible. I don't know what a young American means, and I'm not American, when they say they're a socialist. And I'm not sure Bernie Sanders is anything other than kind of a Labor Party center-left social democrat in European terms. So he can call himself what he wishes. But I think what animates people who label themselves is just a desire to reverse some of these forces, that not all regulation is bad. It's not socialist to say that, I don't think. Not all protection of workers' rights is bad. Not all provision of basic services in healthcare is bad. And that's, in the United States context, all of those things are called socialist today, or worse, communist. And yet, that's not the case in Japan, by the way, which still has a fairly resilient social safety net and healthcare systems and less polarization also as a result. So this is an interesting country in that context, and so too is Switzerland, which is where I live and work. So I think that recognizing that these labels, what's behind them, is really a cry to try and reverse a little bit of what's been happening for the last 40 years. And when you look at data on things such as youth unemployment or the impoverishment of youth who are employed, and how their low income, lack of ability to save, inability to afford decent housing, et cetera, et cetera. These are rampant problems throughout many of the Western developed countries. And of course, this will alienate them from the political system. We shouldn't expect otherwise. And of course, they will then look for some other kind of label to describe it. But how does that get mobilized into something practical, pragmatic, and realistic? And I'm too old to answer that question. I think that the youth themselves are going to have to answer that one.
Janani, do you want to make any comments about the youth? Okay, other questions and comments? Oh, sorry, yes, I forgot. Yeah.
With your point, I noticed your point focused mainly on the challenges with Web 2, if I may. The problem lies in the centralized power, the data control over the user data. They monetize this data for their exclusive profit. Then platform power, unilateral account bans, content universal at will, and one-sided algorithm changes, and then also economic concentration, monopoly and only ad revenue and platform user-generated content, and arbitrary platform fees, for example. Given the Web 2 challenges, how would you compare the centralization aspects of Web 2 and Web 3 blockchain-based system, if possible, if you can elaborate a little more? And then also, the second question would be also how do you see these decentralization system, which is Web 3, I assume, applying to the decision-making process in other contexts?
These are very good questions. I think Web3 does have some possible solutions that we can be working with in terms of blockchain and more federated systems.
Can you say what Web3 is? For those that are not that tech savvy.
Yep.
So Web 1.0 was basically still one way. You could have a website, but it wasn't interactive. Web 2.0 was social media, where you can start posting and commenting, and it's going back and forth. Web 3.0 is a whole new kind of system of blockchain, where there's more ability to have privacy and breaking things down. And, you know, we're still discussing, and the concern is the tech innovation sector still has the incentive to control it all. So we have to figure out how this next wave of innovation, how will it work? And we see it a little bit with AI, with the generation of different ability to put together large language models that can serve different purposes. How about I promise I will answer this question next year.
Any other final questions or comments? Yes.
My question is addressed to Lisa. So, I was really excited with the idea of the pro-social technology market. So, but I was wondering how you or your colleagues are planning to monetize through the business, because you cannot monetize data, personal data, and so on. And also, apart from the social media domain, now, as you know, many new innovative ideas of taxation are emerging, like aviation tax or currency exchange tax and so on. So I wonder if you have any comment on those ideas.
All right. So yes, we've been researching different monetization models and whether there is a way to use advertising, but is not in this surveillance capitalist approach that Facebook has used. So, for example, Maria Ressa with Rappler, they've just created Rappler Community. So Rappler is a Philippine news agency. They produce independent news. And she's just started a social media aspect to Rappler. It's called Rappler Communities, where she is still using advertising, but she has journalists doing fact-checking. And so it's a different model where journalists have decided, instead of trying to get their stories put on a social media network, they're going to actually host their own social media and allow people to have deliberation and dialogue about news stories on the news site itself with advertisement. This is the only real way I've seen a pro-social network being able to monetize. It's still relatively new, but Maria's hoping that this provides some way that other journalists might be able to sort of take control back so that you have fact-based journalism paired with a social network.
Great. Any other last final comments? We have to vacate the room at 5 o'clock. Well, if not, it gives me great pleasure to kind of thank all of our speakers, Stein and Olivia and Keith and Lisa and Janani. I think they've all shown you what a treasure trove we have in the Toda Peace Institute in terms of talented people within different thematic areas. I think all of us, to some extent, are leaning a little bit towards the pessimistic side of pessimism and optimism at the moment. But one of the things which we began to confront yesterday in the meeting was, how do we maintain levels of hopefulness? How do we maintain a kind of courage to resist when resistance is needed? How can we learn from people like the Bishop of Washington how to talk truth to power? And most of all, how can we build solidarity between ourselves across countries, across cultures, and so forth, so that the United States and President Trump aren't able to dictate, how Japan should comport itself in the next 5 years, so that they can't determine how Australia will comport itself, or New Zealand, or any other country. And so for me, this is a sort of a moment when we're going to begin testing the utility of alliance and alliance relationships, and whether or not they're going to serve the purpose for which they were originally intended, namely guaranteeing the security and well-being of the peoples, From a New Zealand perspective, for example, we now have a whole unit reactivated in our Ministry of Foreign Affairs to monitor absolutely everything Donald Trump says over a 24-hour period, and to resist and to figure out ways in which we can resist it. And I'm sure other foreign ministries are doing exactly the same. So how do we work from where we are, which is the issue of locality? How do we kind of take account of all the different contexts that we're a part of? And most of all, how do we kind of not get overwhelmed by the flood of a negative opinion, which is flooding the airwaves at the moment. It's just too easy to be depressed. Keith is confining himself to 15 Trumpian minutes a day. Maybe that's an antidote, but more importantly, I think we have to kind of make sure that, our social media, our traditional media, universities and so forth, are all emboldened to do what they were developed to do, which is to kind of give individuals a chance to understand what is true about the world, what is false about the world, and to stand up to those that wish to impose their views on us, who have a dominatory view of power over rather than power with, and who at the moment are kind of generating much chaos. I keep on saying, when my father was dying, my daughter asked him what was the key to a happy life, and he said it was love. And so we need to kind of activate that in a way in terms of our relationships to make sure that our networks are strong and resilient. And we need to kind of cultivate courage, because courage itself is something which evaporates very readily in the face of opposition. And hopefulness is absolutely key to everything. And so those three commodities, I think, are also part of our nonviolent weapons in the struggle to kind of make sure that the world doesn't overwhelm us, and that we don't lapse into a global conflict in Northeast Asia, and that we start resolving the 56 different conflicts that are occurring around the world. And so it beholds me to also thank our Toda Peace Institute staff who put this all together, who managed to get the interpreters. Thank you to the interpreters for all your very good work. Thank you to those who are doing a video so that we can post it on social media and make sure that there's some countervailing pressure. And thanks to all of you for coming and spending your afternoon with us. That you've given us that most precious commodity of all your time. And I hope that you feel that your gift to us has been repaid with the messages you've heard.